Welcome back to Unmasked, where we take off the filters and get real about faith, failure, and finding freedom. I'm your host, Wesley Farnsworth, a dad, veteran, author, and a man who's learned that God does his best work in the middle of our mess. Each episode will have honest conversations with people who have walked through addiction, pain, or doubt, and with pastors, leaders, and everyday believers who are learning to live and lead authentically. So take a breath, pull up a chair, and let's get real. This is Unmasked. Today on Unmasked, I'm joined by a special guest. Her name is Shaye Sparks, and she has overcome so much in her life, including abuse, addiction, anger, depression, low self-worth, and so much more. And she's here today to share her testimony about how she became unmasked and how she's overcome all of these different things. So Shaye, thank you so much for being with us today on Unmasked, and we're excited to hear your story.
Well, Wesley, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, without further ado, let's jump in and tell us all about your story.
Gosh, well, so one thing that when I think of unmasked, the word that comes to mind is surrender. And so if you don't mind, I'll share about a time where I first realized to surrender. And I'll paint the picture. I was 16 years old. I had just woken up from a night of drinking and come to the cold air of February in the Midwest, opening my eyes and having the huge weight of embarrassment and shame and of being humiliated with a DUI the night before. And I had been drinking since I was, the first time I got drunk when I was 11, and then started drinking daily at 15, and then slowed down a little bit, and then at 16 got a DUI. And so now here I am waking up to the realization that I got a DUI the night before, and just the feeling that just surrounded me in my room was the worst feeling I can imagine. One of the worst at that time that I could imagine. And I just had always been a believer. I grew up going to church. I went to Sunday school all the time in my youth and my teenage years. Even though I was still doing bad stuff, I had given my life to Christ as maybe between the ages of 8 and 10 years old. So he was always walking with me. And so at 16, in that moment, the shame was there that it was like, wow, God, I surrender. I give up. This is your life to live for me. I'm screwing it up. So do with it what you want. Now, I say that, but it's not like the movies like Wizard of Oz and clap your hands, all of a sudden it's Technicolor. I mean, that's not how real life works at all. But it was definitely one of the pivotal moments of my life that really helped me lean into what being humble means. And I think we have to be humiliated before we can really understand what being humble means, and how surrender is such a huge part of our faith.
Yeah, surrender is definitely a big part of our faith. And it's something that I think a lot of people struggle with because there's just this overwhelming desire for us to maintain control and to want to have input on what's going to happen next in our lives. And so being able to give that up is not an easy thing.
Yeah, it's you hit the nail on the head. Control. I think we're also conditioned, right, to believe that we have to have control, that we have to and then we have to maintain it, right? And the truth of it is that when it comes from fear, it's just going to end up hurting you in the long run, that control, rather than coming from a place of freedom. And it's really about just leading. It's about being a leader rather than control.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you say, share with us a little bit more of your story about kind of what brought you to this point to where you were like, you know what, I'm trying to do this on my own and it's not working. Something has to change. What brought you to this point, and how did you realize that you were trying to do everything on your own and that you needed to just give it all to God?
You know, I think I was leaning on the at that stage of my life at 16 and my wise years of 16 years old, right? I think I was leaning on the my surroundings, my support, quote unquote, system, my friends, my family, and what was going on there. And, I personally wasn't doing anything out of the norm. That's what my friend group was doing and my family was doing. So it wasn't something that it was like I turned away from my relationship with God. It was, I just leaned into more of what society was doing rather than listening to what God was saying to me. And I won't necessarily know that he was actually speaking to me at all. If he was, I was drowning it out with the alcohol, right? And I feel like, with that said, I feel like there are probably more pivotal moments in our lives. For me, that was the first one that I can recall. And then there was at least another one, at least two more, when I was in my mid 30s and I was able to get out of an abusive relationship and was like, okay, God, I'm been obedient. So now what? Now I'm handing again back everything to you. I started Christian counseling right away. Um, and was really asking myself the question and really asking God the question in order to heal me. And the question at that moment was, what is it that I don't know that I need to know in order to move forward? And the reason that question came up for me is how often we focus on what we know. And if you know anything about the cycle of abuse, is that a lot of times that's familiar, right? And so you only know what you know. And so if you've come from a abusive background, then you don't know that there's other options out there. You don't know that there's a whole nother life. If you only know if all your family had only go to college, you don't know that there's other things to go into after high school, military, the trades, getting a job, other things, right? And so I just really leaned into with God because I was doing a prayer journal, still do at the time, and really leaned into that question of what is it that I do? What is it that I need to know? Show me, tell me. I'm listening, or, bring it to me, bring it to my awareness. And there was it still is every time I journal, there's such a beautiful relationship dialogue, if you will, that I have with God to really help guide my steps. That saying is, if you want to make God laugh, make a plan, right? And I fully believe in my own journey, learning that healing journey. I really learned that, like, okay, God, I have no idea what's next. I don't know now what I need to focus on. And it all really started with the word love. I didn't know what healthy love really looked like. And not just healthy love in a relationship, but healthy love for myself. I mean, I shared with you prior to this interview that I had very low self-worth. I didn't understand what that looked like to have confidence, to feel good about myself. I had confidence that I could do in my career and I looked good in my career, but in my personal life and when I stepped away from my job, didn't have it in me. So to really learn about what that looks like was another pivotal moment for me.
Yeah, I think that you hit a key word there, and that's the word learn. You know, excuse me. It's really hard for us to accept that we don't know everything, especially when it comes to our own life.
Yeah.
And so it's everything that we do is a learning opportunity, a learning lesson. There's something that we can learn from everything we do, every decision we make, every job that we have, that we can use to apply to our life as we move forward. And I think that's an important way to approach things, because if you go into something knowing that you know, or thinking that you know everything, then you're going to miss out on an important learning opportunity.
Absolutely. I feel like so many people talk about failure, but then they don't talk about how to really utilize that quote unquote failure. It's really not failing. It's just learning. And, when I'll take something that I learned from the book Mindset from Carol Dweck is when we're students, right, and we fail a test or we flunk a test, there are a certain group of people who look at it as, oh, what do I need to study more? What do I need to learn? And there's a group of people who are like, I'm such a failure because I failed this test. And I was in that camp for most of my life. And I didn't realize it until I started journaling and really capturing my thoughts, because we are conditioned, we're programmed, we're human. We live on autopilot, right? And we have this voice that goes on in our head that we don't even realize is happening. And so during this moment of time in my world, I really took time to capture and write down what is it that I'm thinking. And I started to notice how things were showing up that I would never say to another person. But yet I'm saying it to myself. And I was like, wow, like how terrible of me to be doing that. And that's another layer that a lot of even churches don't speak about. But that's another layer of how the enemy gets to us, right? Is that inner negative voice that really harps on us and beats ourselves up and says, you're not good. You're no good. You're not good enough. You're not whatever enough to do the things. And so to really be able to look at what it was I was thinking and how I was living in the world because of those thoughts, it changed my life.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to realize. And, the show Unmasked is all about having people on that have come to realize that it's better to speak out and speak up about things that they're going through than to keep it bottled up. Because when you're able to do that, you're able to start walking in freedom from those things that are holding you back, that are keeping you imprisoned in secrecy and in fear that somebody is going to find out whatever it is that they're trying to hide, whether it be an addiction or a bad relationship or whatever it is. And I think you brought up a good point there with journaling is, there's a lot of people that are not ready to tell another human being what they're going through. And in a lot of ways, they may not even be ready to tell themselves and admit it to themselves. And so journaling is a great way to kind of start that process and opening those doors to get you to the point where you can start talking about it with other people to experience freedom. And that's in my book, The Blueprint of Becoming, it's actually one of the tips that I give people to unlocking their blueprint of becoming is journaling. Something I do in my own life. And so what would you say to the listeners that are, I want to start journaling, but I'm not quite sure how to do that and do it effectively because I'm afraid I might write something wrong or, something along those lines. So Shaye, what would you tell the listeners that are thinking that type of thing?
Yes. Well, first of all, congratulations on your book. And I'm so glad that you added that to your book. That was my first book. What it was basically on was a journal prompt book to really ask the questions that God had me ask and look at myself to really understand how to walk myself through this process. So one of the first things that I realized is it's not about getting it right or wrong. It was just literally capturing your thoughts. So in my first journal, and I have saved most of my journals, and I just came across it recently and I was able to look back in my first actual journal, which was probably, 20 plus years ago. I wrote down, because I had to journal, by the way, between seventh grade and senior year every single day in English class. So I hated journaling. Okay. So let me caveat by saying that. But I now see the purpose. And so here I am so many years later, and I'm literally sitting down with a pen and paper, not a device. And I think that's key, is sitting down with that pen and paper and really saying, this is stupid. What could I possibly write about? I have nothing to say and blah, 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 blah. And whatever thought was coming up here, I would write it down. And through this process, I was at the same time working with the dean of psychology at a local university on a mindfulness program. And we were really talking about neuroplasticity in our brain and how when you physically write the old school way with the pen and paper or a crayon marker, whatever, right? There's something in your brain that those thoughts come down through your arm, your hand, through the pen onto the paper, and it frees up space in your brain. It frees up more neuroplasticity so that you have more room to learn things, so that you have more room to feel things, to consume things, to know, to understand, rather than all of the negative stuff just taking up space. So as I started to write I don't know what I'm doing, this is stupid, this isn't going to do anything for me, I just kept noticing what's showing up for me every day. And so there were many days of, I don't know what to write about, but I'm still writing. And here I am. The birds are chirping. Oh, I hear this. Oh, I hear that. Whatever. random stuff. And then through that, I was really able to notice that there were questions that showed up out of, I feel like God given them to me through my writing and saying, okay, let's talk about this. Let's think about this. Like what shows up when I ask myself this question. And to be honest, like I said, when we're running on autopilot, which is how we normally operate in the world, we don't even realize we have this voice running through our head. And so to really just sit down and write anything out of your head is going to give you grace when you are able to look back at it later and go, wow, look at the headspace I was in, a month ago, 3 months ago, years from now, right? I was just recently working with a client who had never written anything down in his life, never journaled, absolutely hated the idea of it. And I said, well, what if all of those things that you're saying to yourself about how you have to be the perfect leader is actually just thoughts in your head? And once you write them down, now you have space to learn how to be a quote unquote perfect leader rather than beating yourself up because you're not a perfect leader. And he literally had tears in his eyes and he's like, wow, Shaye, I'd never thought about that. I never thought of actually learning how to become one. I was just beating myself because I wasn't one.
Yeah, I love that. It's one of those things that I had somebody ask me, like, how do you journal? And I tell them, if you don't know what to write, just sit down, put your pen on the paper and just start. Even if all you're doing is drawing circles, just keep drawing circles until you have a thought or something come to mind, and then write it down and explore it. And eventually you're going to start writing. And the important thing is that you don't filter yourself as you're writing. Just be honest and write what you're going to write. For me, I hate writing. I hate my handwriting. So I tend to do it on a keyboard, on a device. That's personal preference for me. But I use the same principle. I just write until I'm done writing and then I stop. But the important thing is to just start, because you won't get anywhere unless you start. And if you're like me, sometimes I like to have specific prompts to kind of get the juices flowing, because I don't want a paper full of circles. And so there are lots of websites out there that have journaling prompts that you can use to start if you're looking for something like that. In my book, I have about 3 pages full of journaling prompts that you can use on various topics, from everything from professional stuff to relationships to anything and everything. So again, that's out there if you want that. But it's important, though, as you're journaling, to then be able to take that and figure out what to do with it. And eventually you're going to have something come to mind that is just going to kind of start eating away at you. And you're like, this is something that I didn't realize was an issue. Isn't something that I realized I need to talk about. And that brings us to the importance, I think, of community. You mentioned it earlier when we were talking or when you were sharing, and it's something that I harp on a lot when I'm doing podcast interviews and even on my own podcast, because community is so important. It's important that you have people around you that you can speak to and be honest with, and that will support you and point you in the direction that you want to go, instead of holding you back. So talk to us a little bit about how community has played a role in your own life.
Yeah. So one of the things at that ripe age of 21 or at 16, I was so wise, but for whatever reason, I grabbed onto this and held on to it. So part of getting a DUI, I had to go to court. My lawyer didn't show up. My mom was with me. She said, just plead guilty, blah, blah, blah. Long story longer. I was not awarded. I don't know when you get your sentence, right, was to do mandatory, because I was a minor, to do mandatory AA. And one of the things I learned in AA is that when you have a community around you who support your sobriety, then you're more likely to remain sober. If you have a community around you that continues to do the things that you don't want to do, you're going to relapse. And so I I held on to that thought process. And so over the years, I found myself really finding people who were like-minded as well as like-hearted, goal-driven, oriented, family-oriented, faith-filled people. And when I would step out of that and go around people who were, maybe doing, and I've been sober since I was 25. I didn't get sober at 16, but I've been sober since 25. And when I put myself in that circle, it was a more of an uplifting belief in me that I didn't ever experience before. I'll give you an example. So when I was going through this healing journey after my ex was in his car accident, I was in my mid 30s. I was a hairstylist at the time. And in my career, hair clients come and sit in my chair every 4 to 6 weeks on a regular basis. And through Christian counseling, through books, through podcasts, through journaling, coaches, things that I had been really diving into in this healing journey of peeling away the layers of the onion that I am, that we all are, I started to share what I was experiencing with my hair clients. And I'm like, you're never going to believe what I learned about myself today. And they're like, what? And I'm like, I learned that I'm literally cannot talk about what I need to talk about. I talk around it. I don't actually say what I mean and mean what I say. I like to use sarcasm. And they're like, oh my God, me too. It's so fun. And I said, did you know that sarcasm is actually anger in a clown suit? And they're like, what? And then I said, I just really started to dive into being scared and vulnerable and saying the things that I really needed to say. And what ended up happening is my relationship with my father completely shifted. And then I would tell this client this client would go away 4 to 6 weeks, come back, sit in my chair, and they're like, oh my gosh, because of what you said to do. I tried that with my team at work or my boss, my spouse, my kids, my parents, whatever. And my life, my relationship with them has changed. Have you considered becoming a coach, writing a book, starting a podcast, becoming a motivational speaker? And at the time, in the back of my head, I was like, I would love to do all those things, but I can't. I don't have the confidence for it. So because their support of the community, that even though they were paying me as hair clients, they were my community that I was listening to, I borrowed their confidence in me and said, well, what if they're right? And if I hadn't have followed that what if they're right and looked at their confidence in me as something that I could just try on for a little bit and see what happens, I don't know where I would be. My whole life changed from that moment on, because I really took on the way that my supportive community saw me rather than the way my inner negative voice saw me and my negative community saw me.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. I like the term or the phrase that you just said when you said you borrowed their confidence in you. And I think that's something we could all do, as we're struggling with things. It's easy for other people to see what we don't see because we're our own worst critic.
Right.
We're our own worst enemy. And so if other people see confidence in you and you can't see that topic or that strength in yourself, then borrow their confidence in you and try it on for size. I guarantee you they won't mind. And worst that happens is you don't like it and you give it back to them. There's a return policy there, but it's important though that you have that person that you can talk to. For me, it was my counselor, and I'm involved in a ministry called Celebrate Recovery, which is a Christian version of AA and all of the other groups, except that we don't focus on a specific topic. We just focus on life issues. So people come for everything from drugs and alcohol to low self-esteem to addictions to food and all kinds of stuff. And it's important that you have the counseling and finding that person that you can be honest with. And if you're not somebody that wants to go to a recovery group, which is not for everybody, I get that, but I would highly encourage you to check one out if you're struggling with something, because there's a lot of very helpful tools that they can teach you that apply to so much more than just an addiction or struggle of any kind. But there's other resources out there. There's family, there's pastors, there's friends that you can talk to. And if all of those things don't work out, then there's counseling. And counseling and counselors have this way of asking you questions that if somebody else asked you, you'd probably blow them off, but they're able to ask them in a way that triggers something in your brain and really get you thinking and sharing. I know for me, counseling has been big in my own life, and you mentioned it earlier. And so I want to kind of explore that just a little bit and share with us how counseling has impacted your life and what you would tell to the person that is saying, I've thought about doing that, but I don't know if I could bring myself to do it. There's still that stigma around counseling and health and mental health a little bit. It's getting better, but it's still there. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I want to mention something that you said is really focusing on or finding, because maybe you're one of those people, someone in your audience is thinking this, like, I don't have anyone that I can talk to. So I want to talk to you for just a quick second. There is a term called safe, and it's important to find that safe community where you feel safe. And you mentioned Celebrate Recovery and counselors and all of this. If you have found that you're around people that are, you call friends, say, and you walk away and you might share something with them and you walk away and you feel violated, you feel icky, you feel like you're the one who did something wrong, they aren't safe. And so it's really important to find people who are safe. And I love that you mentioned Celebrate Recovery, because a lot of times people in Celebrate Recovery are safe, right? And I had a counselor that was not safe. So that's why I bring it up. And I felt icky afterwards. And it took me going at least 3 times to figure it out, that I felt like, wait, she's blaming me for things that happened to me as a child. Like, okay, that doesn't compute. But I had to like check in with myself. Like, how do I feel after I leave there? So for me, then to try again counseling, a friend of mine had actually given me the name of this Christian counselor probably 2.5 years prior to me using it. And she had it written down on a sticky note with his name and number. And I literally put it in my wallet to save. I was like, one day I'll get there. I always knew that counseling at this stage of my life, well, actually, even as a child, when my parents got a divorce, right around the time I got a DUI, actually right before that, I my mom has started going to counseling, and she suggested that I go to counseling. And I was like, the stigma, absolutely not. I'm in high school. There's no way I want counseling. I don't want anyone to know what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking. Absolutely not. And yet in the back of my mind, I thought at some point I will have to go. So then I tried it again in my 20s, where it was an unsafe person. So now here I am in my mid 30s, and I found a safe counselor. And at the time, there wasn't even a question. It was absolutely, this is who I have to go to, and now is the time. And I think that if we pay attention, God will place little hints, seeds, if you will, in our thought process of maybe not now, but someday you'll go to counseling. So if you're in the audience and you're thinking, well, not right now, but maybe someday, it's okay that now was not the right time. Just know that you will follow through on that someday, and be open, because that counselor might not look like how you think they're going to look. One of the things I learned is that when you're going through a journey, a healing process, you're the student. And when you're ready, the teacher appears. And then at some point, after you've gone so far, you become the teacher and the student will appear. So be open to who that teacher is.
The scene from Karate Kid came to mind when you were sharing that just now. You have your sensei, and then eventually you become the sensei and you start
Yeah.
teaching the next generation. And the same thing applies here. And, I would say if you're one of those people that are listening to this and you're like, well, I just don't want to go because I'm afraid of what somebody else is going to say. You
Mm.
know what? And when you're dealing with recovery, there's a saying that we often say where you have to focus on your side of the street. You can't focus on the other person's side of the street. If somebody wants to say something negatively about you because you're trying to better yourself, then that's an issue that they have to deal with on themselves. And don't let that stop you from making yourself the best person that you can be. And I'll be honest, like when I started going to the counselor here, I was like, well, I don't know, what if somebody sees me? And then as I'm sitting there and as time has gone on, a lot of the people that I thought, well, what if they see me? I see coming out of that very same office. They're there for the exact same reasons. They're trying to better
Mhm.
themselves. And so don't let what somebody else might say, the key word there is might, what they might say stop you from bettering yourself.
Yeah, because if someone speaks negatively about you, especially when you're trying to recover and change and grow and heal, that says more about them than it has anything to do with you.
Exactly. And you know what? If they're not in your inner circle, if they're not in that close group of friends that or family that you allow speaking into your life, then who cares what they say? And if they are in that inner circle, well, then maybe you need to evaluate if they're going to continue to be in that inner circle.
Right.
It's all about having people that are going to point you in the direction that you need to go and support you in your journey to becoming the person that God wants you to be.
Agreed.
So what would you say? One of my key phrases that I often tell people and say on the podcast is, you're not defined by what you're done. You're not defined by what's been done to you. And you're definitely not defined by how you were brought up. You're defined only by who you say you are and who God says you are. Talk to us a little bit about how that has played a role in your life and how you've not let your past define you. And because of that, share where you're at today and what you're doing.
Yes, that's such a great question. So about 4 to 6 months in my healing journey, that whole phrase that I just said, the student is ready, the teacher appears. And when the teacher is ready, the student appears. I had probably 4, maybe 5 women. Some were friends, some were clients, some were random strangers tell me or share with me that they had been in abusive relationships. Now, they didn't use that word abusive, but they would share that there was some control or non-support or lying or manipulation. Something was happening. One said abusive. And I just really stood in the truth of who God designed us to be, with boundaries and self-respect that I didn't know about before this, and really stood in as a warrior, I guess, if you will, for them, and my experience and what I learned, and shared with them the words that I wish someone had said to me. And that is when I really started to learn about myself, that that's how you become the teacher. Right? You become the teacher because you go through all of these obstacles, you overcome them. And then God says, here, share, because you are a wonderful example of what it looks like on the other side. So the question is, what am I doing now? Well, that was the beginning of how it started. And then the other was my hair clients, telling me, go do these things. And so once I borrowed their confidence in me and started to learn, well, what if I do these things? What if I start a podcast? What if I write a book? What if I become a coach? What's the worst that can happen? Oh, I get a new skill. Okay, great. I can always do hair. I can always stay at the salon. And so as I started to learn and do those things, more opportunities started to show up, more things started to shift inside me, like, well, maybe I want to get out of doing hair and really focus on these. And so almost 4 years ago now, I retired, quote unquote, from the salon business and went all in on my coaching and my podcast and speaking. And not to mention, it literally has come full circle now, but I was retired, like I said, but I moved from the Midwest to Florida and removed myself from people who weren't growing at the pace I was growing. And I say that because they were still my support system, but they were in the mode of, I'm happy where I'm at in the status quo. And I wanted to surround myself with at least someone or more people of, I'm on a growth journey, a scaling up journey, if you will, and who else is. And so now that's the type of people that I'm meeting. And when I removed myself from what I knew, is meeting more people who are on that journey. So who God says I am is a beacon of light for him to just shine his light through and help others heal, understand, and grow.
So you're obviously not letting your past define you. You're not letting it stop you from becoming this person that you feel like you're supposed to be. So tell our listeners where they can find you now and what kind of things you're doing now. If they say, man, Shaye, you sound like a really cool person, I want to know more about you. Tell our listeners about that.
Yes, thank you. I am on all social medias, Facebook. I'm not on TikTok. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube at Shaye Sparks, SHASPARKS. You can find my website, ShayeSparks.com, and then my podcast. I have a podcast as well. It's called The Shā Sparks Show. I have a website, theshayesparksshow.com. You can leave me a message there if you want. But feel free to connect with me, DM me, let me know that you heard me or saw me on the Unmasked with Wesley, and I would love to connect with you. Love to have a one-on-one conversation. I do take one-on-one coaching clients. However, I do have a group for purpose-driven entrepreneurs and creators. That is really my passion, my love right now, my purpose.
And if you want to find those links, I'll leave them in the show notes to make them easy for you to access. Well, Shaye, thank you so much for being with us today on Unmasked and sharing your journey about where you've come from and how God has brought you out of that and how you've become unmasked and are now helping other people.
Well, thank you for being courageous and taking this step to start this. This is fantastic.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks for joining me today on Unmasked. If this episode encouraged you, would you take a moment to follow, rate, and share it with somebody who you think could benefit from hearing it? For more encouragement and information on having me speak at your church or events or my coaching services, visit wesleyfarnsworth.com. And don't forget to connect with me on social media. Until next time, remember that grace is greater than your past, and freedom begins when we all live unmasked. God bless you.